Hey, hello everyone. Welcome to Ancient Modern. Today I'm very happy to have with me Caleb Ontiveros, who has had a very interesting background, both to do with classics and with text. So he's obviously a perfect guest for Ancient and Modern. So Caleb, well, first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So I wonder if we could just start off talking about that background, because as I understand it, you were originally a graduate student in philosophy, and then you got into tech that way, right?
Yeah, that's right. So I went to graduate school for philosophy for a bit, and then I got my master's, hopped out to do tech work, basically. I enjoyed grad school quite a bit, but I learned that becoming a philosophy professor was probably not the ideal track for me for a number of reasons. And the barrier to entry for tech work is quite low, and it's intellectually interesting. There's a lot of stuff to do. So it's where I made my move.
So can I ask, what were you particularly interested in when you were a philosophy grad student? Were you into ancient philosophy in particular, or was that something that sort of came along the way?
It was not my main focus. My primary focus was initially in philosophy of religion. I went to Notre Dame, and then also in ethics and political philosophy. So of course there's some relation there, but my primary interest was not in, say, historical ancient.
Okay. So did you have maybe it's asking too much, but did you have any kind of Catholic religious background when you were at Notre Dame, or you just happened to go there? Because I know it's a
No, my
Catholic school,
background,
right?
it is a Catholic school. My background is in evangelical Christianity. I'm not a Christian, but I've always been interested in philosophy of religion, both in terms of initially arguments for and against the existence of God, but also other ways of thinking about religion, or how we ought to think about religion given our current place in time.
Great, yeah, interesting. So okay, so then you got into Stoicism. So why Stoicism in particular? I mean, because with that background, I'm thinking maybe you would have studied Aquinas or Augustine or one of these other, great religious philosophers, or Kierkegaard, who knows. So what was it about Stoic texts that grabbed you?
I think Stoic texts were initially have eminently practical and practical. So excellent combination of theory and practice, I suppose. I came across Stoicism initially in some courses in undergrad. I read Epictetus. It didn't actually stand out to me, his work initially. Probably mostly because I was just thinking about it from a sort of technical, meta ethics lens. And then I came across Stoicism later by reading Nassim Taleb. He has some bit on Seneca in Anti-Fragile, I believe, or Stoicism generally. And then at that point, I went back and read Marcus Aurelius, some of Seneca's letters, and I found it much more useful at that point in time. I think when you read a given piece, that the time when you approach a particular philosophy matters quite a lot for how one approaches it and how it impacts you. So,
Yes.
especially for things like Stoicism or other, say, more religious type philosophies or philosophies of life.
Yeah, it's funny. I remember, so when I was an undergraduate, I had to read Seneca. He was kind of on some kind of a reading list. So I was reading some of Seneca's letters, and my dear mother has some sort of claustrophobia, and she doesn't like going to tunnels and on the underground thing, or on the metro, things like that. On the subway, you're talking to an American, I need to get my dialect right. Anyway, so I remember reading Seneca's letters, and there's a couple of letters. I don't know if there's one specifically about going into tunnels. Maybe there was one about worries about travel or going on a ship or something. But I remember translating this bit of Seneca for my mother. And this is, before modern Stoicism. I just had this, I think probably a lot of students have had this moment where they're reading Seneca and they think, wow, it's just very practical. It's very applicable to life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a number of psychological insights. Of course, there's the view of emotion, I believe, are the most striking Stoic views. It is in all, say, the big three Roman Stoics. And then there are a number, I think, especially in Seneca in particular, a number of different asides or letters he has focusing on particular aspects of social life, whether it's managing fame, success, or dealing with pressures from the crowd, what have you.
Right. Okay. So then it's really interesting because we live in interesting times because one of the things I got into, sort of like you got into Stoicism, kind of for no reason. It felt like for sort of reasons I didn't understand. One of the things I got into was Buddhist style meditation, which obviously a lot of people have gotten into in the West over the past few years. And I guess I got into it when it was still pretty analog. Still, people would just meet up in groups or meditate at home, and they turn to books. And there was starting to be some things on the internet. And then more recently, there's been all these apps, right? Headspace was a big one. So all these meditation apps, mindfulness apps, etc. So I guess it sort of stands to reason in some sense that if there are people interested in Christianity and Stoicism and Epicureanism and all the rest, there's going to be an app for that, as they say. Hopefully that's not too reductive a term. So you've developed an app called Stoa, right? Which is an app for Stoic style meditation, or is it Stoic style mindfulness? Is that how you would describe it?
I would say it's an app focused on the theory and practice of Stoicism, and one aspect of practice is meditation or contemplative exercises more generally. So that's how I would put it. There is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy that is influenced by mindfulness or based cognitive behavioral therapy, and that shares quite a lot in common with Stoicism. Both cognitive behavioral therapy and Stoicism have this sort of cognitive model of emotion that I gestured at earlier, which is that our beliefs impact how we experience the world, and often it's much more useful to focus on our thoughts or beliefs, particular cognitive distortions we might have, rather than, say, different subconscious elements or one's history or something like this that other therapies or philosophies might take those other routes. So yeah, that's how I put it. It's Stoicism, focusing on the theory. You've got conversations with different philosophers, psychologists, different lessons on what Stoicism is, and then put that into practice with a number of contemplative exercises, some of which are standard meditations, others more Stoic infused.
Right. So you've raised something very interesting already, which is this sort of interaction also with cognitive behavioral therapy. So we live in a world where we don't just have all the sort of great religions and philosophies of the past to choose from. We also have sort of these modern psychological techniques, which are therapies, and in a very real sense, just as Epicureanism and Stoicism can be seen as therapies. And yeah, if you read, so I was just reading the Enchiridion, Epictetus's Enchiridion, the dagger, with my students for actually a history of political thought course. But it's a very clear and striking opening to do with this division into, there are things you can control and there are things that you can't control. And I've always loved that, except that I've kind of fallen out of love a little bit with it over time, because and I have this issue a little bit with cognitive behavioral therapy too sometimes, which is it seems to say there are things you can't control. And I definitely agree with that. There's so many things you can't control. And then it seems to say, oh, there's things you can't control. And it often seems to suggest that the things that you can't control include your thoughts. I don't know if I'm getting this wrong, but I think that's actually kind of difficult sometimes, right? So I've kind of moved more towards the position now, like there are things you can't control, which is like your life and the universe and how things are going to go in Ukraine, and etc. Sure. And it also includes like your thoughts. So, so then what you can control, I suppose, is at this point is just sort of your actions. Does that make sense? Have you had a similar evolution, or do you still think thoughts are something you really can work with quite effectively?
Well, there are different forms of thought, right? So there are, say, initial reactions or something of this sort. There's, you're driving and then particular thoughts pop into your head. This sort of thing, it does not seem correct to say that you have control. Longer style beliefs, like this is something I value, or particular patterns, if you notice patterns of reactions, that sort of thing, one at least can have responsibility over and can shape. So maybe another way to think about the dichotomy of control from Epictetus is a view on what we fundamentally are. And in Epictetus's view, what we fundamentally are reasoning beings. So because that's what we are, we have the ability to make judgments and make decisions. And that's it. And of course, these might be influenced in particular ways, or some decisions might be harder than others. But at the end of the day, that is what we are and what makes our character. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's kind of, it reminds me a lot of Aristotle. Well, I mean, Aristotle seems to have several different definitions of man or human being, anthropos. But one of them definitely seems to be that, man is a rational animal, as well as a political animal. Man is also a rational animal. So it seems to have a similar strain. It's kind of interesting that I'm just thinking of this sort of world we're in with all these options. Yeah, there's Stoic meditation apps. There's not so much sort of the tradition of the academy or of the Lyceum. I don't know if there are any sort of peripatetic communities out there online or any kind of hardcore Platonists. I mean, there probably are. But.
Yeah, well, what is a hardcore Platonist? It's maybe a little bit harder to come up with an account of that. The Aristotelian makes more sense. But I think a number of modern Stoics are quite close to what technically would be the Aristotelian view. So the hardcore Stoic view is that virtue is the only thing that is good, that is fundamentally of value. And there are some modern Stoics that don't obviously subscribe to that view, and they might think that have something a little bit closer to the sort of standard Aristotelian type view. So to some extent, I think the Aristotelian view is almost not entirely, this is not entirely true, but you can get a lot of the same benefits from modern Stoicism in a way.
Yeah, so when you're talking about the hardcore Stoic view, is that kind of along the lines of you're entirely kind of self-sovereign and virtue is its own reward, and therefore you can, as it were, sort of be happy on the rack? Because I remember there's a passage in the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle where he says, no man can be happy on the rack being the sort of torture implement. And the idea is, for Aristotle, yes, there are things you can do with your mind, and you can try and be rational, and you can have the various parts of your soul aligned. But ultimately, a flourishing life is also one that has these external features of, the right kinds of friendship and living in the right kind of civic communities. So is that what you mean? So you're saying so modern Stoicism does have a little bit of give in that Aristotelian dimension?
Well, I would say some contemporary Stoics certainly have that kind of view. They, or at least don't explicitly subscribe to the view that the only thing that matters is virtue, and whether or not you're on the rack has to do with whether you want to be on the rack or not. But there's no sense in which that being on the rack or not is bad, other than making a statement about one's desires. What the Stoics called, so just to, I suppose, explain a little bit more for people who may be less familiar with this, Stoics thought there was this aspect of value called preferred indifference, which is to say that the Stoics are sort of in between the Aristotelian school and the Cynic school. The Cynics thought that the only thing that mattered was virtue. The Aristotelians believe virtue mattered, but also some other contingent aspects of your life matters to living a happy one. Whether you are respected, have a high reputation with other virtuous people, and so on. And Stoics sort of fall in between. They think that virtue is what fundamentally matters, but there are this class of things called preferred indifference. All things considered equal, it's better to be healthy than rich. It's better to be healthy than not, better to be rich than poor. So these sorts of things are preferable, but ultimately valuable. So that's a traditional view. It's preferable not to be on the rack, but doesn't make one live fundamentally a worse life.
Interesting. Yeah. So I mean, the emphasis again, I guess, then is that you can sort of have some kind of you can find some kind of value in every situation, not necessarily happiness, because I suppose that what we would call happiness nowadays is more the Epicurean ideal. It's more the sort of ataraxia, but the undisturbedness of the Epicureans, but and the pleasure principle, the idea of hedone of the Epicureans. I wanted actually, we're talking about a lot of things at once, which is good, but I wanted to go back a little bit because I was talking about CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, a really popular and well-researched style of therapy in modern psychology. But I know you've also written a little bit in this context about ACT, so acceptance and commitment therapy, and the technique there, the emphasis there, even though it seems to have come out of CBT, so it shares some of the presuppositions, the emphasis there seems to be on sort of, becoming friends with your thoughts, sort of letting individual thoughts come and go. But then there's this further emphasis on commitment to your values. Mm-hmm. So it seems to be one of these schools of modern therapy where it's kind of like, feel the fear, but do it anyway. So, you may feel anxious about something you have to do, but then you think, no, my value set, or like what I really want to achieve in life is this. So then you do it. And that does sound a lot like Stoicism, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it fits very well with Stoicism, because I think the contemporary view of what's wrong with, say, a lot of negative emotions, a very common contemporary view, they all feel bad. But what both acceptance, commitment therapy, and Stoicism would urge is that it's not just that they feel bad, but that they prevent us from living the life we want to live. And ACT has a number of practices for, say, accepting particular negative emotions, and then nonetheless living in accord with your values. And that fits very nicely with Stoicism, where you can still have these negative initial reactions or particular bad feelings, but what matters ultimately are your more considered judgments and how you express those judgments in your decisions.
Okay, so so one of the big questions with any kind of intellectual history, I suppose, is when we find these parallels and when we find these similarities between different schools of thoughts, say Stoicism and acceptance and commitment therapy, is there a direct influence here, or is it just that human beings in different times and places, having similar brains and similar issues, similar problems, will come up with the same ideas time and time again? So which one is it here? Do you think there's any kind of link between ancient Stoicism and these modern therapies, or is it just sort of happenstance that they came across some of the same solutions?
Well, with some of the precursors to cognitive behavioral therapy, like rational emotive therapy, which is, I believe, invented by a fellow named Albert Ellis. Ellis was explicitly influenced by Epictetus in particular, and would cite phrases like, it's not things in themselves that harm us, but our view of them, which is a very common Stoic line from Epictetus, also appears multiple times in Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. ACT does not, as far as I know, the people who have developed and extended ACT have not cited the Stoics explicitly, though they do have a number of Eastern influences. So I would say at best, there's a very indirect influence of the Stoics on the development of ACT. There is always the interesting question: suppose Ellis had never stumbled upon Epictetus, would he have come to the same ideas? It's not totally impossible to think he would have. I think it's, especially this view about emotion, is not unique to the ancient Stoics, even though they are perhaps unique to the extent that they emphasize it in their work. So yeah, not totally unlikely.
So you mentioned some Eastern influences, and going back to this Buddhist meditation thing, it's been very interesting to me in the course of my own life that I was sort of raised as a Christian and brought up in the West. And then there seemed to be a phase, say in the 90s and the early noughties, where really the only people who were talking about meditation and working with the mind directly were Buddhists, or maybe people from sort of a neo-Hindu direction. It was all sort of Eastern, and you almost had this very strong idea that kind of Westerners didn't do mysticism. And I think, if you look at the history of that, it doesn't seem to be right. There is a lot of mysticism in the Western tradition and the Christian tradition and others. But it seems like that wasn't emphasized, or it was left behind. And then there's this other interesting effect where I think a lot of people in the West have looked east and they thought, oh, it's all so mystical. And if you go to India, you have these mystical experiences. And of course, people in Asian countries are, like people everywhere, they're working. And even when in terms of the religious practice, if you go to Thailand or whatever, and you go to a temple or a monastery, there are monks who are very interested in meditation, and they very much apply themselves to meditation. But often in secular Buddhist practice in Asia, meditation isn't that strongly emphasized. In fact, they look at some of the Westerners and think, wow, you guys, it was some of the Western Buddhists, and think you guys are really into meditation. So I suppose what I'm getting at here is, so modern Stoicism, and especially in the way that you've taken it with this app, it's kind of become this Western spiritual tradition now. Do you think the Western Stoic community is doing this sort of on purpose to try and find a spiritual tradition that has Western roots? Or is it just something that comes naturally from growing up in the West and being exposed to these texts? And what's the relationship with all these Buddhist meditation apps and this Buddhist meditation movement? Are there modern Stoics trying to sort of copy that, or are they reacting against it? What's the relationship with that?
Well, I would say modern Stoics have different relationships to, say, Westernized versions of Buddhism. A number of people, say, who use Stoa also use other meditation apps, or have a history of using other meditation apps that are inspired by Buddhism. And yeah, I think there's a range of different views on that. As to why sort of Stoicism has an appeal to people that maybe Buddhism doesn't, is that what you're getting at with the question?
Yeah, I mean, that is one question, I suppose. So I suppose there is a set of people who they obviously are able to get headspace and go to the Zen center, but instead they choose to engage with the modern Stoic community. So yeah, maybe that's the way of putting it. So why do they go for modern Stoicism rather than Buddhism, I guess, is one question.
Yeah, well, personally, I used apps like Headspace quite a bit when they first emerged. And I always wished there was something like Headspace, but with Stoicism. And after a while, it occurred to me that this thing wasn't going to be built by itself, and that was a pretty good person to build it. And a lot of people have felt that way, I have discovered. And why is that? I think it's in part because Stoicism is connected with a philosophical tradition that emphasizes rationality, philosophical, in a way that Western styles versions of Buddhism do not. I think Western styles of Buddhism often are, already emerging in cultures that are fairly rational, as it were, and initially focused on the more mystical elements. And I think Stoic philosophy has some amount of mysticism in it, and it is life philosophy in the way that religions are life philosophies. So it has a number of overlaps, but of course it has a deep philosophical tradition to it that is distinctly Western.
Yeah.
So I don't know I don't think that makes it better per se. Like maybe there are some upshots and particular philosophical beliefs that Stoic have that Western Buddhists don't, that I find a lot more plausible. But I think in a way it's an aesthetic that can attract particular person a way of thinking that's more natural to people who may find the Western versions of Buddhism harder to grasp onto.
That's very interesting. Yeah, so I agree. I mean, there's obviously a very strong emphasis on reason in Stoicism, in ancient Stoicism especially. And I mean, even in sort of types of empiricism and sort of theories about the world, where I guess modern Stoics have just to a great extent had to jettison the stuff about the the Stoic cosmology and the cycle of universes and conflagrations that destroy universes and then universes being reborn and stuff like that. But no, I can see there's a strong emphasis on rationality in Stoicism. It's interesting to me because I guess I sort of left Christianity partly because I started to find some of the main narratives just, literally unbelievable. And so then I was looking for some kind of rational faith, and like a lot of Westerners, I thought, oh, that's Buddhism. But then it's very interesting because, I think maybe some of the Theravada schools, they can be seen as syllogistic, like the Four Noble Truths, in a sense, quite rational, quite reasonable, like, assuming you kind of go along with them. But, they're clearly sort of steps in an argument just to some extent. Then, one of the major schools of Buddhism, which has really made it in the West, is Zen Buddhism. It's quite big in California, obviously. And that all got mixed up in its Chinese phase with Taoism, which is, I would say, an extremely kind of anti-rational way of thinking. So yeah, I could understand how you might come to that and think, whoa, I don't understand this at all. I'd like to do something else. Okay, so thinking about doing something else, I actually wanted to, there's more topics along these lines that we can probably talk about a bit later, but I actually wanted to invite you to sort of lead a short meditation, if you would. Just anything along the lines of what kind of thing people might find on your app, like some kind of Stoic meditation.
Sure. So we'll do a meditation that's called a view from above meditation. This term was coined by a French philosopher named Pierre Hadot, who did a lot of work on how ancient philosophies were philosophies of life, views about how to live the best human life. And they had a number of spiritual exercises with them. And these are one of the spiritual exercises that he brought out. So let's do that. So typically we start these sessions by asking people to ensure that they're in some place where they're able to meditate for a few moments. And then take a few deep breaths. If you're able to, or if you like, close your eyes. So this is a visual contemplative exercise. So start by picturing yourself wherever you are meditating. Just imagine looking down on yourself from the ceiling, perhaps. And now visualize whatever city you're in larger perspective by considering how thousands of others are acting around you. And zoom out even further and picture urination. Just imagine looking down on the millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of lives, whatever it may be. And to the extent that you can, picture the earth and the small amount of space you take up on it. And from this perspective, from this view from above, ask yourself what your role is. What is your part in the larger picture? And if you're struggling to think of anything, just don't overthink it. We're in many different social relationships. One role is to be a good friend, be a good child, a good parent, a good employee, a good boss, good citizen, whatever it is. Bring those to mind. And from this perspective, and with your roles in mind, ask what fundamentally matters. Often people find that once you inhabit a larger view, it's easier to let the trivial fall away and focus on what's important. With this in mind, just summarize any thoughts you may take away from this exercise. And bring your attention back to where you are now, wherever you are, meditating and contemplating. And take a few deep breaths. And if your eyes are closed, open them. So that was a view from the above exercise.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, I suppose I'll just tell you what I kind of noticed about it. I think it's very interesting. My first impression was, have you ever played Assassin's Creed Odyssey? You know, you can, if you haven't, you can toggle to like an eagle's view. So you're suddenly seeing things from above. So I kind of thought of that. And then I was thinking of these astronauts who go up into space and they see the Earth for the first time as a whole, you know, and it's this great spiritual experience that sort of puts things into context. So I did feel kind of humbled in a good way, though. not in a kind of crushing way, but in a kind of like kind of cheering way. Actually, my issues, whatever they are, my problems, aren't that great in the large scheme of things. But it's interesting because I also noticed that some of the stuff you were saying later on about what's your role in life, that it had quite a civic orientation, I thought, with regard to what are you doing in your life vis-a-vis other people. And it strikes me that I've done some, for example, metta meditation, the loving kindness meditation in the Buddhist tradition, especially the Theravada Buddhist tradition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it's quite hypothetical, really. I mean, it's very much, especially the way it's presented in the West, is like, let's just do this as an experiment, like project loving kindness to people. But it's almost like you don't really need to follow up. Just like do it as a psychological experiment and see how it makes you feel. Whereas this one seems to be more kind of hands-on, like think about your role in various social networks in your village and in your city. Do you think that's right?
Yeah, I think it's concrete. I think with this exercise, and that's called the contemplation of the sage, where one contemplates a role model, it's important to do the visualization aspects of the practice, but also picture specific actions one might take. And contrast it a bit with meditations. It's less focused on feeling per se. So I know different forms of meditations might revolve around feeling compassion for oneself and then for others, and then sort of branching out in a specific way. It's less about feeling compassion per se as thinking about, okay, what is my role here? What are the things that I should be doing to be a good person, to put it bluntly.
Mm.
A number of people have found meditations very useful, but I think there is always the risk that it's too focused on feeling and has the, I don't think feeling a particular way is usually a blocker for acting any particular way. I think that's a possible trap a number of people fall into.
Right. So it's interesting because it brings me back to something I wanted to talk more about, which is Stoicism and Epicureanism. Because, as I say, I was just teaching this course about the history of political thought. And we had 1 week where I was talking about what I call these Hellenistic worldviews. There were various Hellenistic, worldviews and, ways of thinking about life in the Hellenistic period, philosophies of life. And I was saying to the students that these two ones that became especially popular, Stoicism and Epicureanism. And it seems that Epicureanism at bottom is about pleasure. I mean, Epicurus in the letter to Menoicus and elsewhere, he's very keen to stress that it's not libertinism. This is the great misinterpretation of Epicureanism. And it's not just about pleasure in the sense that you go and have an orgy, you take loads of cocaine, or you drink lots of alcohol, or whatever. It's more avoiding disturbedness of mind. So you try to reach the state of ataraxia, undisturbedness. All the same, it does seem to be true that kind of like classical utilitarianism, maybe utilitarianism ultimately is about individual states of mind, right? The ultimate aim is everybody being chill or everybody being undisturbed. Whereas Stoicism has this more of a strong emphasis on virtue. Would you say that's about right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think is an accurate description of Epicureanism. Of course, Epicurus had this view about what the good was, which is the pleasurable life, and then these additional empirical views about maybe the way to get there, and that was not through the view where we don't live very long and so we ought to marry, party, and so on. Rather, it was, as you say, more of a focus on tranquil pleasures. So he has also an empirical type view about how to get to the more pleasurable life, which is, for Stoics, those are one and the same. What is good is virtue and You don't need that, especially, empirical beliefs about how to get there. Nothing special there.
Right. So, I mean, I was kind of thinking out loud in this discussion section with the students, and I was saying, I think in some ways Epicureanism is uniquely or, outstandingly something that goes together with liberal individualism, in the sense that, if it really is just about your individual feelings, you're feeling better, you're feeling good, you're feeling undisturbed, then that's very much something that I think very much a worldview that people have today, especially in the more developed West, right? It's not really about, I think a lot of people more and more are rejecting these big religious narratives. I mean, the rate of belief in traditional religions seems to be declining across the developed West, although not elsewhere in the world. And so it's almost like I would expect a neo-Epicureanism to be like the big thing at the moment. And I don't know if you've read this Stephen Greenblatt book about Lucretius, The Swerve.
I have not read that book. No.
I recommend it, actually. I mean, it's kind of a popular take on Lucretius and the discovery of the one manuscript of Lucretius by Poggio Bracciolini. But Greenblatt also has, his own views, and I think it's totally legitimate, and he's done a beautiful job of kind of weaving them into this narrative. But he basically is taking this sort of anti-Christian, anti-clerical view, and the idea that Epicureanism is a philosophy that allows for pleasure. There's even this scene where I think Poggio goes to like a bathhouse in medieval Germany, and he starts to think, oh, this is like a bathhouse in the ancient world, and we can have various types of sexual pleasure that the Christians are denying us. So that's kind of where Stephen Greenblatt takes it. But I kind of finished that book, and the book ends with this sort of almost triumphant quotation from Thomas Jefferson, who writes in a personal letter, "I am an Epicurean." So as I say, like in some ways, it's almost surprising to me that we're not all Epicureans nowadays. And then I think, because I was never really into sort of modern Stoicism myself, and I just sort of got interested in it really, really recently. But now that I'm looking around online at your stuff, and you were on the Sunday Stoic podcast, there's Sunday Stoic podcast, there's a Daily Stoic podcast, there are all these big figures who are publishing books that sell pretty well about modern Stoicism. So what is it about that? Like, because in some ways, modern Stoicism seems like a hard sell. It's about virtue. Like, who talks about virtue nowadays? So if I'm right that modern Stoicism is a much bigger thing online than modern Epicureanism, like, what's up with this?
Yeah, it does seem right to me that Stoicism is much more of a phenomenon than modern Epicureanism is. Yeah, it's an interesting question why that is. I would guess that part of it is historical. Epicureanism fell out of fashion with Roman elites relatively quickly, although it did persist among different parts of the empire. So there was no sort of Marcus Aurelius as an Epicurean. There are no accounts of that, really. And there are fewer sort of foundational texts, if you will, that we have today. So I think that's probably one key reason why we don't see a modern Epicurean movement. And then there's another key reason may just be that the ideological space is anymore. We have utilitarianism already, and that what's the large difference between utilitarianism and Epicureanism? Maybe some additional views about how to live the good life. Perhaps maybe there's not so much there by way of either like a persuasive account or something persuasive in both the rational sense of persuasion and also these more rhetorical sense that there's nothing else to really latch on or build a movement. Yeah, so there's those aspects, and then I suppose another aspect that's just coming to mind now is that Epicureanism emphasized the garden more than the city, which is an aspect of which is, I think, one reason why it was not as appealing with Roman, aristocratic elites as Stoicism was.
Yeah, I wonder also whether it's right that there's far fewer texts from ancient Epicureanism, and sort of one of the only big ones we have, you know, Lucretius's De Rerum Natura. I mean, I think it's a fantastic poem. I love teaching it, but there's a lot of physics in it, and there's a lot of kind of bad physics, you know. I mean, yeah, it's the kind of thing, you know, he tries to explain everything in terms of atoms in the void, because for the ancient Epicureans, you know, one source of mental disturbedness is religious beliefs, even though they thought the gods did exist, but they were just sort of not that important. So one path to kind of chilling people out is to sort of explain to them that nightmares are just the projections of atoms sort of randomly flying around the place, and Zeus isn't really hurling thunderbolts at you. That thunderbolts can be, lightning and thunderbolts can be explained by, you know, clouds bumping into one another. So, I mean, that's all well and good for the ancient world, but I think that nowadays, when we pick up a text like that, like the average punter, you're not really interested in like the ancient world and ancient physics and stuff. You're just sort of like, whoa, there's a lot of like weird descriptions of atoms that sort of are, in some ways they seem to anticipate modern physics, but in other ways they're just strange and wrong. You know, like there's a bit in Lucretius where he says, the moon is some people say the moon is actually really big, it's just far away, but that's obviously nonsense, because look, you can tell how big it is. You can see it in the sky. So there's just these parts of it which are just sort of wrong. I think that even if you look at like Diogenes of Oinanda, you know, this text, this guy, rich guy, basically put up a monument to Epicureanism at the end of his life, and even that has a lot of physics in it. So I think you know, there's too much of an entry cost in some of ancient Epicureanism before you get to the actual ethical and psychological teachings. But so one interesting thing about Stoicism as well, modern Stoicism, I find, is that, yeah, it does seem that there are people who are involved in it who are interested in virtue, and as I say, that it strikes me as unfashionable in some ways. I mean, as I say, I don't really think I was ever really part of this community. I'm getting more into it now. I think it's really interesting, but because I didn't really look into it very deeply, I was just vaguely aware that some people really don't like it, and I found that a bit confusing. You know, like I think Donna Zuckerberg has a bit about it in her book, and the idea is these modern Stoics, and they are sort of right wing, and they're all emphasizing masculinity and things like that, and I don't necessarily get that vibe. I mean, when I've looked at stuff online, it seems to be more the psychological emphasis. If there's any masculinity in it, it's not really that sort of chest beating. It's more kind of you know, dealing with your emotions. So is that perception that I have accurate, that some people really don't like modern Stoicism, and if so, why do you think that is?
So I personally have not encountered that too much. I do think there are some pieces, some maybe pockets of people who have argued some passionately against Stoicism, or probably more accurately, a clump of things of which they think Stoicism is a part. So I wouldn't overrate how, I'd be careful not to overrate how dominant these sorts of reactions against Stoicism are. That being said, I would say that critiques like Donna Zuckerberg's are mostly a function of Stoics with a number of other things she doesn't like. Some things she doesn't like for a good reason, which is, you know, trolls on Twitter with different classical statues, posting right-wing nonsense or something of this sort, of which there's very, I have not encountered anyone who's used the Stoa who has those sorts of attitudes. So given how many people have used Stoa, it wouldn't be that surprising if there are one or two. Yeah, so I think that mostly it's just a critique by association. If I wanted to make another, there are some people who make more substantive critiques of Stoicism, but are perhaps less passionate. And one very common critique is that Stoics are too passive. And by having this model of what it is to live well, they have a view that is either not good for people who are being oppressed, or even worse, is useful for oppressors. So the model would be, all you need to live well is to be virtuous. therefore, if you are, committing rights violations against someone, you can just give them this doctrine. And the thought is, okay, this is a sort of thing that one should be suspicious of at the political level. So that's maybe a more substantive critique one could make of Stoicism. That's less of a guilt by association type charge.
Yeah, although that one
Association.
actually kind of immediately strikes me as unfair, just in comparison with more quietistic ways of thinking. So I think that, I mean, even among Buddhists, there are people who stress that Buddhism is a religion and it has social aspects to it, and you shouldn't just hide on your cushion, as I've heard people say. But I think you can go to some very quietistic places in the Buddhist tradition. It's a tradition that reveres sort of extreme types of hermits, and the Christian tradition has that too. In Stoicism, it seems like even in that meditation we just did, there's actually quite a strong emphasis on sort of engaging with the world. And maybe this is one of the reasons why it sort of outcompeted Epicureanism even back in the day. Because as you say, for the Roman elite, just sort of chilling out in a garden really wasn't the way forward. I mean, Lucretius couldn't even convince the addressee of his poem, Memmius, right? So yeah, I think that, I don't know, I mean, imagine that you're into modern Stoicism and you're also into whatever philosophy floats your boat. Maybe it's sort of contemporary notions of social justice. We see that those two things could be compatible, right? That you get into a state of mind where you think, the virtuous thing is to, I don't know, reduce, help climate change or whatever it is, reduce inequality. And it seems like these techniques could help you with that, if that was your thing. Maybe if that's not your thing, it can help you with something else too. But it seems like it does have compatibility with political action.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, it's compatible. I think one of the key cardinal virtues is justice, and that is, a key part of justice is political action. At the same time, I think one kind of speech the Stoics, ancient and modern, should be wary of are more expansive views of harm. So like particular views about, speech being harmful, or maybe views that are focus values other than truth. I think Stoicism has probably going to lean more on the it's very important to come to true views side of things instead of better to say avoid discussing particular topics because they might be offensive or something like this. So I do think that probably behind, I think there are more substantive disagreements with people who hold particular kinds of social justice views and Stoics. But there's plenty of potential overlap. But climate change is a fine example. I'm sure there are many other things, from economic policy to policy over scientific research, what have you.
Great. Okay. So we're sort of nearly at an hour, which is, I always think it's the ideal amount of time for a podcast conversation. But there's one other thing I wanted to fit in, which is that besides doing all this great work with the Stoa app, you're also engaged in a website, which is now on Substack, I believe, called The Classical Futurist. And obviously the title, in the title, there's a lot of great possibilities, just like with the title Ancient and Modern, a lot of great possibilities. So
that's right.
So what's the Classical Futurist, and what kind of classicism does it involve? What kind of futurism does it involve?
Yeah, the Classical Futurist is all about seeing the future through an ancient lens. It's about taking ideas that started by three of us that we like, that are both in that maybe the futurist type space, and also ideas from the classics, and seeing how they might fit together. It's a bit of a intellectual adventure, I would say, more of a matter of exploring particular ideas than promoting a specific cause. But I think that there's a lot of great work going on in futurism, where that's thinking about big picture questions like, what is the trajectory of artificial intelligence, or different questions about what's the direction of history, and then of course a number of questions that the ancient tackled, their views on technology, or their views on the rise and falls of city-states and so on. So there's basically this is the thesis of the classical futurist, is to take some key insights, key intellectual starting points from the ancients and see how well it meshes with our contemporary world, and especially with questions that are related to the future.
Yeah, I think, today's conversation was a great example of that, because, I was going to say something like, as we've shown, but in a way it seems sort of so obvious. We haven't really had to do much work. These ancient concerns about happiness, unhappiness, the meaning of life, what you do with your thoughts, your painful thoughts, your pleasant thoughts, all of these concerns which were central to ancient Stoicism, but also Epicureanism and other ancient philosophies and religions and ways of life like Christianity. All these things are still of huge concerns to humans. And, then we have maybe modern analogs to them and cognitive behavioral therapy and other approaches. And we can also kind of play with the ancient stuff that we thought was maybe past and gone. We can revive it and sort of talk about it and take the bits we like and maybe leave some of the bad physics behind. And you can make apps with that. So I would encourage people to look up the Stoa meditation app, which you can find anywhere you get your apps, I suppose. And also the classical futurists. And you could just also Google Caleb Ontiveros, who's been our guest today. So thank you very much, Caleb, for this great conversation.
Thanks for having me. It was a blast.